The moment I found our support dog gone, and my daughter sobbing on the porch, I saw red. Karen didn't just cross a line, she bulldozed it. What she didn't know. I don't lose legal battles. Especially not when it comes to my kid. 3 weeks later, a federal investigator knocked on her door, and trust me, that wasn't a courtesy call. And no, this isn't a movie. This is what happens when a Karen-backed fake HOA plays militia in the wrong neighborhood. Freeze frame, yep. That's me. The guy whose private well HOA Karen tapped into to illegally water her garden. What did I do? I flushed her system with sewage. And oh buddy, that was just the beginning. Let me rewind a bit though, because this whole thing didn't start with sewage sabotage. It started with a girl, a dog, and a community president with too much time, hairspray, and God complex on her hand. My daughter Ember is 11. Sweet, shy, brilliant. She also has PTSD. When she was 9, we were in a car crash that left her with deep trauma, both physical and emotional. She came out of it alive, thank God, but not unchanged. Sirens make her shake. Crowds make her panic. And if you ever want to see pure despair, try taking her into a Walmart during the holidays. Which brings me to Maple. Maple is a golden retriever, and frankly, the best soul I've ever met, which includes most humans. She was trained for a full year as a psychiatric service animal. I watched Ember laugh for the first time in 6 months the day Maple sat in her lap and licked her tears away. The dog isn't just a pet. She's my daughter's lifeline. Without her, Ember shuts down. With her, she can go to school, handle noises, make friends, basically, function like a kid again. So when we moved into this neighborhood, quiet, leafy, full of big porches and bored retirees, I thought we were getting a fresh start. A nice place where Ember could heal and I could maybe breathe for once. What I didn't count on was Karen. Her actual name is Cheryl, but trust me, no one calls her that. She's every meme rolled into one, a 60-something tyrant with French-tipped claws and a terrifying commitment to bylaws. She's president of the HOA, and yes, I'm using that term loosely. This HOA was unofficial, self-declared, and run out of her living room, which she once referred to as the community's executive suite. She printed the rules herself on beige paper with Comic Sans headers and expected everyone to follow them like scripture. At first, we stayed off her radar. Ember and I kept to ourselves. Maple did her rounds on a leash, wore her little vest, and napped under Ember's desk during remote classes. But peace in Karenland never lasts. One Saturday morning, as I was pulling weeds, Karen marched up our driveway like a general inspecting the troop. She looked Maple up and down like she was carrying a concealed weapon. "Excuse me," she said, tilting her sunglasses down, "but I don't believe that dog is within weight regulation for this neighborhood. No pets over 25 pounds per the HOA code." I blinked at her, not sure if she was serious. "She's a psychiatric service animal," I replied. "Fully certified. That weight limit doesn't apply." Karen's lips pursed so tight I thought her face might fold inward. The community still has rules. Exceptions create chaos. Surely you understand. Surely I did not. But I smiled and said I'd be happy to provide the documentation, which I did, copies of the ADA protections, medical letters, training certifications. I even laminated them, because I knew exactly who I was dealing with. 3 days later, I came home from work to find Ember sitting on the front porch, pale, shaking, and alone. "Where's Maple?" I asked, already feeling my stomach drop. She didn't answer. Just pointed toward the backyard, tears running silently down her face. The gate was open. The crate Maple sometimes napped in was empty. Her toys were scattered like a crime scene. I called her name. Nothing. I called the neighbors. No one had seen anything. Then I checked my inbox. From HOA_president_Karen@AOL.com. Subject: Community Standards Enforcement Notification. Per our recent observations and in alignment with HOA regulations, The unauthorized animal has been removed pending compliance review. Please refer to Section 6.2b regarding prohibited pet. Fines will be assessed starting Monday. I was frozen for a solid 10 seconds. Then something inside me snapped. This wasn't just a line crossed. It was full-on trespassing, animal theft, and harassment wrapped in bureaucratic toilet paper. I stormed into the kitchen, yanked open my filing drawer, and pulled out every piece of documentation I had on Maple's legal status. But even with that in hand, I had no idea where she was. Turns out, Karen had called animal control, told them a large aggressive dog was roaming loose, and signed the pickup as an anonymous neighbor. The dog matched Maple's description. They took her to the pound. No chip scan. No call. Just straight to lockdown. It took me 4 hours, 2 phone calls, and 1 very long printed letter to get her released. The staff were apologetic. "We've seen this kind of thing before," one woman muttered. "HOA disputes turn real ugly. You don't say." When I brought Maple home, Ember burst into sobs and wouldn't let go of her for hours. I slept maybe 2 hours that night. The next morning, I found a bright yellow violation slip taped to our door. Another fine. Karen had escalated. And it was just getting started. Because when I went out back to check the fence, I noticed something strange. Our irrigation system had stopped working. The well pressure was off. I traced the pipes, checked the pump, and found a line split off, running straight under the fence to Karen's backyard. The woman was stealing our water. My private well water. To hydrate her stupid rose garden. That's when the real war began. And believe me, I didn't fight clean. The night after we got Maple back was the kind that stains your memory. Ember barely slept. Every time Maple shifted or her tags jingled, Ember bolted upright like she thought she'd disappear again. I laid on the floor next to her bed most of the night, listening to her breathing, holding Maple's paw just so she wouldn't start pacing. I didn't sleep much either, because even though the dog was home, I couldn't stop thinking about what it meant. Karen didn't just make a mistake. She took my daughter's legally protected support animal and had the gall to call it enforcing neighborhood standards. This wasn't some passive-aggressive note about a trash can. This was targeted, premeditated, and cruel. I kept thinking about how Ember had looked sitting on that porch, small, frozen, like the world had confirmed her worst fear. That people would never accept her. That even when she followed the rules, they'd find a way to punish her for being different. I grew up scrappy, the kind of person who could shrug off being disliked. But Ember isn't built that way. She still thinks the world should be fair, and for the life of me, I want to keep that illusion alive just a little longer. The next morning, I opened my email and found a new gem from Karen. This one came with an attached PDF. She'd filed an official HOA complaint citing us for having an unauthorized animal of questionable legitimacy, and warned that if we didn't comply within 7 days, she'd pursue property lien measures to recover mounting fines. Let me repeat that. This woman was threatening to lien my home over a federally protected service dog. Now, here's the thing Karen didn't know. Before I became a full-time remote employee and Ember's advocate-in-chief, I spent 8 years as an ADA compliance specialist. I've helped design workplace accommodations, filed lawsuits against businesses who failed to provide access, and written internal policy for 2 Fortune 500 companies. I know the Americans with disabilities act like most people know their Netflix password. Karen had picked the wrong hill to die on, and I was already preparing the shovel. But before going scorched earth, I needed confirmation of what I already suspected, that Karen didn't just bend the rules, she flat out broke them. I went down to the county office to pull property records. Karen's so-called HOA was, in fact, a voluntary neighborhood group registered 10 years ago with 0 legal enforcement rights unless voted in by 75% of residents. That vote? Never happened. Her board? 3 of her friends who once hosted a chili cook-off. Her bylaws? Printed from an online HOA template and altered with a ballpoint pen. Even better, Her role as president had technically expired 2 years ago. She just never told anyone. So not only was she illegally issuing fines, but she had no legal standing to act on behalf of the neighborhood at all. But of course, that didn't stop her. Because when people like Karen get a taste of power, they don't care if it's real. They just care that people are afraid to challenge it. And then it got worse. On Wednesday, I came home from the grocery store to find an envelope duct-taped to my front door. Inside was a printed notice with bold letters. Final warning: service animal in violation. Immediate removal required. Failure to comply will result in forced eviction proceedings. Forced eviction. I laughed out loud in my driveway. Then I stopped laughing. Because behind the drama and insanity, she was actually scaring my kid. Ember asked me that night if we were going to have to live in the car again. The idea that she associated losing Maple with losing her home made my stomach twist into knot. I held her hand and told her the truth. Nobody is taking Maple away. And nobody is kicking us out. Not without a federal courtroom and a media circus watching. The next morning, I called Animal Control and filed a formal complaint. Then I called the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Service animal discrimination is a violation of the Fair Housing Act, and they take it seriously. I sent them the complaint, the paper trail, the video of Ember crying on the porch. I even sent screenshots of Karen's emails, complete with timestamps and threat. But I wasn't done. I also started talking to neighbors, and it turned out we weren't the first ones she'd targeted. One couple said they were fined for planting sunflowers that didn't match the aesthetic. Another had been written up because their son's wheelchair ramp interfered with property uniformity. Karen was equal opportunity awful, and people were tired of it. I gathered statements, got permission to record conversations, and made copies of every flyer and email she'd ever sent. Then came the part one really enjoyed. Remember that pipe I found connected to my well? The one illegally running to Karen's garden? Well, I made one very tiny plumbing adjustment. I rerouted the line through a gray water barrel. Not sewage exactly. Just not drinkable. Smelled like a wet sock left in a compost bin. And then I waited. 2 days later, Karen marched up to my door, red-faced, clutching a dead hydrangea and waving a plastic cup of suspiciously murky water. "What did you do to my irrigation line?" she demanded. I sipped my coffee and smiled. "Oh? That pipe running from my well to your backyard? That's strange. I didn't authorize any connection. Sounds like an illegal tap. You should probably report that to the county." She sputtered, turned, and stomped off. That night, I heard the unmistakable sound of a garden hose being hurled into a trash bin. But of course, Karen wasn't done either. Because she never quits when she's behind. No, she held a secret HOA meeting, unannounced, unofficial, and claimed I was endangering community cohesion by spreading lies. One of the other neighbors tipped me off. Karen was trying to rally the board to vote on issuing a mass complaint that would force me into arbitration. She even told them I'd forged the service dog document. That was the moment I realized something. This wasn't about rules or dogs or hydrangeas. Karen wanted control. She wanted me scared. And when I didn't cave, she went full crusader mode. Which was perfect. Because I had just received an email from HUD. They were sending someone to investigate the claim. A real federal investigator. And if there's one thing Karen hates more than dogs over 25 pounds, it's accountability. So I printed everything. Every document. Every screenshot. Every neighbor's statement. I filed it into a nice, clean binder, labeled it Karen's Greatest Hits, and waited for the knock on her door. The best part? I wasn't the one who told them where she lived. One of her own board members did. The morning after I found out Karen was trying to orchestrate some kind of neighborhood coup against me, I did what any mildly unhinged, over-caffeinated parent with a legal background would do. I got up early, brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to melt silver, sat at my kitchen table, and started building a folder I titled Operation by Karen. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to dismantle her power brick by brick, using the only thing she seemed to fear more than a big dog: facts. It started with digging. Not literal digging, though I was tempted to bury her fake bylaws in her front yard. No, I pulled every HOA email she'd ever sent, going back years. Turns out, Karen never used blind copy. That meant every list of recipients was public, and she copied herself on every message. She must have thought it made her look official. What it actually did was give me a detailed timeline of her reign of petty tyranny. I organized it all: dates, topics, threats, fake rules. She fined a guy for hanging wind chimes. She threatened a woman with eviction for putting up a pride flag. She once wrote a letter claiming a neighbor's choice in mailbox paint was lowering property values. That was real. I had the PDF. Beige paint, apparently, was not community appropriate. I started reaching out to people one by one. Some were skeptical. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. But once I mentioned the HUD investigator and the federal violations Karen had racked up, they started opening up. One guy said she fined him for his grill being visible from the street, even though it was behind a bush. Another swore she'd tried to sneak a rule banning children's toys in front yards past the board, because colorful plastic cheapens the visual harmony. That was a direct quote. Visual harmony. She really talked like that. But the smoking gun came from Marcia, one of Karen's so-called board members. Marcia had been with the HOA since the beginning, back when it was more of a glorified social committee. She told me flat out that the official vote to make the HOA enforceable never happened. Karen just started acting like it did. When I asked for meeting minutes or a vote record, Marcia sighed and said, "There are none. We had margaritas and talked about lawn games. That was the whole meeting. And yet here we were, with fake fines, fake rules, and a very real threat to my child's mental health and legal rights." That's when I decided to go full throttle. I contacted an old friend of mine, Deanna, a disability rights attorney with a talent for terrifying people without ever raising her voice. I handed her the binder, the HUD complaint file, and the emails. She read through it, slowly sipping her tea, and said, "This woman is going to regret learning how to type." Meanwhile, Karen must have sensed something shifting in the air, because she started trying to do damage control. She went door to door with cookies, actual cookies, trying to convince neighbors she was just misunderstood, that everything she did was for community standards. I watched from my living room as she stood on one porch saying, "We can't just let people do whatever they want. That's how neighborhoods fall apart." The irony of her standing there with oatmeal raisin bribes while the federal government was preparing to crack open her little dictatorship wasn't lost on me. Then came the HOA meeting. The real one. The one Karen couldn't cancel or control. Enough neighbors had signed a petition, organized quietly through group texts and burner Facebook accounts, that we triggered a community-wide mandatory vote. It was held at the community center on a Tuesday night. The room was packed. Some people brought snacks. A few brought folding chairs, like they were expecting a show. They weren't disappointed. Karen arrived 20 minutes late, wearing a silk scarf and an expression like she was walking into a courtroom she owned. She stood at the front and started her speech with, "Before we begin, I think it's important to remember the value of unity and leadership in challenging times." I cut her off by handing the mic to Deanna. Deanna didn't raise her voice once. She calmly outlined the legal violations Karen had committed: service animal discrimination, harassment, fraudulent enforcement of non-binding HOA regulations, illegal use of community funds, and personal trespassing. When she got to the part about the unauthorized lien threats, a few people in the audience gasped. Karen looked like she was going to be sick. One of the board members, Bob, who'd been suspiciously silent through most of this saga, actually leaned back and muttered, "Oh damn." Then I stood up and laid down the cherry on top. I played the audio recording I'd taken during my conversation with Karen when she admitted she didn't believe Maple was a real support animal. Her exact words were, You can train any mutt to sit still and slap a vest on it. Doesn't make it a medical necessity. That hit the room like a thunderclap. The vote to remove Karen as HOA president passed with 84%. The other 16% abstained or quietly slipped out before the ballots were counted. No one voted to keep her. Not even her best friend, Sheila, who suddenly remembered a dentist appointment and left early. Marcia offered to step in as interim president until new elections could be held, and the first order of business? Repeal every fine Karen had ever issued. The second? Pass a motion to formally dissolve the current HOA bylaws and start fresh with a legal, inclusive framework. As Karen stormed out of the community center, someone muttered, "Should have brought better cookies." But it wasn't over. Because while Karen was now a dethroned queen with no kingdom, she still had one last blow coming. HUD had concluded their preliminary investigation. They were filing an official notice of violation, and if the case went to court, she'd be on the hook for civil penalties, emotional damages, and potentially even criminal trespassing. I got the email that night. It was the sweetest digital message I've ever read. The next day, I watched from my kitchen window as a black SUV with government plates pulled up in front of Karen's house. A clean-cut man in a suit stepped out with a folder and rang her bell. She answered the door, took one look at the badge, and slammed it shut. Didn't matter. He left the envelope tucked into the door frame, neatly stamped with the federal seal. I took a sip of coffee and thought about how far we'd come, from a missing dog to a full-blown federal inquiry. All because a woman with a badge she made on Vistaprint decided she was above the law. But the part that really made it perfect? Karen still hadn't figured out who tipped off HUD in the first place, and I had no intention of telling her. Let her stew. Let her wonder which of her little subjects finally got tired of bowing to a tyrant. Because the truth was, it wasn't just one of us. It was all of us. Every neighbor who'd ever been silenced, fined, or humiliated. And we were just getting started. Karen didn't show her face for a few days after the federal SUV incident. Her hydrangeas started to wilt, the HOA group chat fell silent, and her front porch looked like it had been abandoned mid-dramatic exit. But I knew better. Karen wasn't gone. She was just regrouping, licking her wounds, and probably speed-googling how to sue your neighbors for defamation while chain-eating snack-sized Twix bars. And sure enough, on the 5th day of silence, she tried one last Hail Mary. An envelope was slipped under my door. No return address, just a thick, overly formal letter on letterhead that said Community Action Coalition, which I could only assume she made up while sipping boxed wine in her home office. The letter was a masterpiece of empty threat. She accused me of harassment, character assassination, neighborhood destabilization, and in one particularly bold paragraph, causing psychological trauma through willful misrepresentation of pet classification. She actually wrote that. Trauma. Because I refused to let her steal my daughter's legally protected support dog. The letter ended with a promise that her legal team would be in contact soon, which was hilarious because last I checked, her legal team was just Bob from 2 houses over, who once tried to sue a pizza place for putting olives on his order. I handed the letter straight to Deanna, who laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. She advised me to frame it. I almost did. But instead, I scanned it, added it to the digital case file, and moved on. Because Karen wasn't the story anymore. She was just a cautionary tale. The real victory was watching everything she built crumble under the weight of her own nonsense. The HOA board, now led by Marcia, invited me to the next meeting, not as a target but as a guest speaker. The topic: how to rewrite community bylaws that actually followed the law. They'd even created a subcommittee on accessibility and inclusion, and yes, I joined it. The first thing we passed was a policy explicitly protecting service animals and their handlers from harassment. The second was a motion to require all future HOA presidents to complete a basic civics training course before taking office. Karen would have choked on her scone. But the most satisfying moment came a week later, when I opened my mailbox and found a letter from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It wasn't just a notice of investigation anymore. It was a resolution agreement. Karen had agreed to a settlement. Not because she admitted guilt, of course, but because she didn't want to go to court. The terms were glorious. She had to pay a fine. She had to attend mandatory training on ADA compliance and housing discrimination. And best of all, she had to submit a written apology to Ember. I read it twice before I believed it. The apology was stiff, passive-aggressive, and clearly written through gritted teeth, but it was still legally binding. It said, "I regret my actions and acknowledge the hardship they caused." That was the line Ember underlined when she read it. Then she looked up at me and said, "Does this mean she can't do it again?" I smiled. "No, sweetheart. She can't." Ember changed after that. Slowly at first, like she didn't trust it, like she was waiting for the next blow to fall. But when weeks went by and nothing happened, no new threats, no angry notes, no surprise visits, she started to breathe easier. She walked Maple around the block without flinching. She smiled more. And one evening, she came into the kitchen with a piece of paper and said, "I want to write a story about Maple being a hero." I cried right there next to the sink. And Karen? She sold her house. Quietly. No yard sale. No goodbye barbecue. Just one day, the curtains were closed, the hydrangeas were dead, and the moving truck backed into her driveway like it had been summoned by divine retribution. Rumor was she moved to a condo in a nearby town with no HOA. Irony doesn't always come fast, but when it lands, it hits like a piano. A few days after she left, I found one last remnant of her reign. A laminated sign stuck to the back of the community bulletin board that read, "Please maintain visual harmony in shared spaces." I peeled it off, rolled it up, and tossed it in the trash. Visual harmony. As if anyone had missed her. That weekend, the neighborhood hosted its first real community meeting without Karen looming over it. Kids ran around with water balloons, someone brought a karaoke machine, and Ember even stood up and introduced Maple to everyone. She wore the vest proudly, tail wagging, as Ember explained what she did and why it mattered. No one rolled their eyes. No one complained. One neighbor even asked if Maple could come visit his daughter, who'd just been diagnosed with anxiety. That's the thing about people like Karen. They build their little kingdoms on fear and silence. The moment people stop being afraid, the whole thing collapses. All it takes is one person to say, "Nope. Not today." And the minute others see that person standing, they realize they can stand too. I'm not saying I'm some kind of hero. I'm a mom. A tired, sarcastic, over-caffeinated mom with a soft spot for her kid and an even softer spot for justice. I didn't go looking for a fight. But when someone comes for your kid, especially under the illusion of authority you know is fake, you don't just roll over. You push back. Hard. And sometimes, when the stars align and the printer works on the first try, you take them down so completely that even their roses won't bloom the same. Looking back, it still blows my mind that this entire saga started with a clipboard and a barking complaint. But it ended with a win bigger than I could have imagined. Not just because Karen lost, but because Ember won. Because a little girl who once shook at the sound of a doorbell stood in front of her whole neighborhood and introduced her best friend with pride. Because the next time someone tries to mess with her, they won't just face me. They'll face a community that finally remembers how to stand together. And if Karen ever thinks about coming back, well, let's just say I kept the binder.